Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our show, we have Daniel Raisbeck, Director Archivo Historico at the Universidad del Rosario in Bogotá, Colombia, and founder of Verdad. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for having me.
Daniel, what is Verdad?
Verdad is a coalition of citizens working together to end the violence created by the drug war in Colombia.
That sounds like a pretty big challenge.
It is. It is.
Before we get into the contemporary details, take us back. Take us back to the early days when this came to your country.
Well, I can tell you about the 80s and early 90s. This is the time when I was growing up in Colombia, and there was a full-scale war of, at that time, it was the Medellin cartel led by Pablo Escobar, perhaps the best-known Colombian drug dealer. And he decided to wage a war on the state because the Colombian state, in collusion with the United States, they were about to sign an extradition treaty to extradite
Escobar
and also other drug dealers. At one point, Escobar offered to pay Colombia's national debt.
To be left alone.
Right. He wanted to be left alone. The government didn't accept, and that's why he set off this war based on intimidation of judges, policemen, ministers, and at one point he even tried to assassinate the presidential candidate, Cesar Gaviria, who eventually won the election. Before that, he actually killed the presidential candidate who would have won the election, Luis Carlos Galán. And this is the environment in which I grew up.
And I understand you lost a member of your family, too.
A member of my family was aboard a commercial airliner that was bombed in order to kill a politician who didn't board the airplane. So even though, for instance, I grew up in Bogotá and you're supposed to be away from the violence in the countryside in Colombia, actually the drug war has affected pretty much everyone in Colombia during the past 2 or 3 decades.
So I understand there was certainly plenty of hypocrisy involved in this drug war as well.
Well, the entire drug war is based on hypocrisy. It's based on a lie. It's based on the lie that if you try to attack the production of coca leaf and of cocaine, that you can drive the prices up to a point where people in the United States or in Europe won't consume. And that has absolutely failed. It hasn't worked. Actually, if you take inflation into account, the prices have actually gone down, and the purity of cocaine and also other drugs has increased.
And you used to spend some time with children of DEA agents?
Right. Well, I went to an American school in Bogotá, and you had children of diplomats and American companies. People who worked in American companies would send their children to the school. And at one point, the children of DEA agents started arriving. And actually, the first times when I did try marijuana, I haven't smoked marijuana in a very long time, but back then I was introduced to marijuana by the children of DEA agents. So this is how absurd
the whole situation.
These are the absurd proportions that.
And when Escobar was finally killed, did that solve the problem?
No, of course not. What happened is that Escobar was killed after the state responded in the war that he waged against the state. He was sold as a public menace, and the way it was sold in the media was that once the state would get him out of the way by killing him or incarcerating him, that this would be the end of our troubles. But almost immediately, he was replaced by another cartel, which was the Cali Cartel, which used other methods. It, in general, wasn't as violent as the Medellin cartel, but they corrupted almost the whole of Colombian society. In fact, Ernesto Samper, who was a president elected in 1994 for the Liberal Party. And well, it turns out that much of his campaign was financed by the Cali Cartel. And he even had his visa revoked by the US government while he was in office. It was the first and only time that has happened to a Colombian president.
Wow. So the whole society ended up being corrupted because of this war, pretty much waged at the behest of the United States?
Well, absolutely, but the Colombian government was complicit all along in accepting U.S. policy without really thinking through what the consequences could have been or were certainly to be. And in terms of corruption, at a certain point, it's really scandalous and unacceptable. For instance, what I mentioned about the presidential candidate who financed his campaign with drug money. But one of the methods that, for instance, Pablo Escobar would use was to threaten policemen, for instance, or judges in Medellin, and other places in Colombia. And he had a slogan that it was either bullets or money.
Pick one.
Pick one. Either you could be bribed and you would be paid, or you would be killed. It was also a very difficult decision for people raising children and heads of families and so forth. It was almost corruption many times against the will of the people who ended up being corrupted.
To stop white powder from going up the noses of Hollywood celebrities.
Right, among other people. Right.
So eventually they got the better of the Cali Cartel. How did that happen?
Right, well, as I said, President Samper was elected and there was a huge scandal also brought to light by what you could call the leader of the opposition, who had these tapes of him or of his campaign people negotiating the entry of drug money into their campaign funds. So Samper really had no choice but to go after these people for the sake of his image. He was fighting his rapidly sinking popularity. So the Cali Cartel was also relatively rapidly taken care of by the Colombian government. And then again, it was sold as a public enemy and we needed to get rid of these people in order to have peace.
Yeah, did that solve the problem once Cali was...
No, absolutely not, because then the FARC, the Marxist insurgency created in the 60s, but around the middle of the 80s, the FARC decides to participate directly in the drug trade.
Take over the business.
Right. Well, sometimes independently, sometimes in alliance with other big drug dealers. At the same time, you have the paramilitary phenomenon. The paramilitaries were forces originally created by landowners to defend themselves from these Marxist guerrillas, but they are also very soon co-opted by drug dealers, or they themselves become drug dealers. So once the Cali Cartel is out of the way, you have a new war, you could say a three-way war between the FARC, the paramilitaries, and the state, all fighting over the same key areas of production and exportation.
So this whole thing is spiraling out of control, and the FARC tries to make the case that this is because they were fighting for the rights of the poor. Does this have anything to do with actual events? Right.
Well, recently the FARC admitted for the first time that they actually may have participated in the drug trade. They used the subjunctive.
Mistakes were made.
Everybody knows. I mean, according to experts, the FARC is actually the largest drug cartel in the world. But they have admitted that they have participated in the drug trade, but they sell it as if they had no alternative in order to carry out their supposedly altruistic struggle
for the poor
and the peasantry and against inequality and poverty and so forth.
And where is most of the violence taking place in the country?
The violence takes place usually in the areas where you either grow coca leaf and produce cocaine, and in the areas that are strategic for the exportation of cocaine. So there's a lot of violence along Colombia's Pacific coast, also in the south of the country, along the border with Venezuela. It's really all over the country. But violence does not usually take place in the poorest areas as the FARC would have people believe. It's actually usually the case that there is an ongoing fight between criminal groups, the FARC being one of them, over strategic areas, strategic economic areas, to take over those areas to strengthen themselves.
Turf battles.
Turf battles, precisely.
This three-way civil war has been going on for a long time. Did it make any difference which administration was in the White House in the U.S., a Democrat or a Republican?
No, absolutely not, because this is a state policy. So, for instance, the president that was elected after Samper, he tried to negotiate with the FARC. His name was Andrés Pastrana. What he did was that he gave them a demilitarized zone in the middle of the country, larger than Switzerland. And what the FARC did was that they used that area to grow even more drugs, to strengthen themselves as a military organization financed primarily through the drug trade. And they were able to really put the state against the wall. So around the end of the 1990s, Colombia was being mentioned as a failed state, or as a potential failed state, in the international media.
And so the violence only escalated at that point.
Absolutely. That was perhaps the worst moment in the last half century in terms of violence in Colombia. And then what this did was it created a backlash that allowed a rather conservative candidate that did not belong at that point to any of the two major parties to launch himself as an independent candidate with a very aggressive strategy to attack the FARC militarily. So between 2002 and 2010, President Uribe was in power, and he did solve a lot of the security issues because before his time, many roads were literally impassable due to kidnappings that would go on and all sorts of things. So the strategy of democratic security implemented by President Uribe was successful up to a certain point, but his goal was to eliminate the FARC militarily, and he wasn't able to do it. And according to my theory, it's because the FARC, as long as they control the drug trade, they will always have enough strength to strike back, or at least to survive any onslaught launched by the government.
And how was Uribe financed?
Uribe was financed primarily by Plan Colombia, which is the military aid plan negotiated by the previous administration, by the Pastrana administration and the Clinton administration. So this is U.S. money and a lot of U.S. weapons coming into Colombia in order to help the Colombian government fight the FARC.
So American dollars are buying the cocaine, and American dollars are buying the guns to fight the cocaine traders, and Colombians are dying.
But unfortunately, that was precisely the case.
So things have changed a little bit recently. There's some sort of peace program that's moving forward. Bring us up to date on that.
Our current president, who has been in office since 2010, Juan Manuel Santos, he was re-elected last year, 2014. His entire strategy has revolved around a peace process with the FARC. So he's trying to solve the violence politically. And they're negotiating in Havana, Cuba. They have been for the past 3 years.
And this has a lot of people nervous.
Right. Well, a lot of people support the peace process. He won his re-election based on the peace process proposal. The entire democratic left has united around this proposal, around this idea. But the other half of the country, more or less, is deeply skeptical of the peace process, and they follow Uribe, who has become the primary opposition figure, and they want to continue trying the military solution against the FARC.
Keep up the violence and see if it works.
Right. When it worked partially during 8 years, but they weren't able to fulfill their goal, which was to end the FARC completely.
So during all this time, you're growing up, you're getting yourself educated. You're now a professor of classics, teaching Latin and Greek at university. How in the world are you involved in all this?
Right. I did leave Colombia during my teens. I was able to get that education you mentioned in the United States and in Germany. And I recently came back to Colombia. I've been back for about 3 years, but I've been following the political situation very closely, even when I wasn't at home.
And tell me a little bit about your profession.
As you said, I'm a classicist, so I studied Greek and Latin, and my area of interest is especially ancient history, ancient Roman history, the Roman Empire. That's what I study, and that's what I try to teach. It does give you at least a historical perspective on certain things.
And you've gotten involved politically more recently.
I ran for Congress last year in 2014, and not because I had a political career planned, but because, among other things, the lack of willingness to address the drug issue in Colombia really inspired me to take an active stance and to enter the political arena.
And how were you received by the voters? How was your message received by the voters?
Well, there was interest, or a lot of interest arose from the message, especially because it was coming from within the Colombian Conservative Party, which is the party I joined. And this is not a party associated with socially liberal issues, for instance, drug legalization. So there was also a lot of resistance within the party, but which gave me even more media attention at the very least. And there was, of course, interest among, I think, university students and young people in Bogota.
So you got a bit of a baptism by fire. Did not win office.
Did not. But in the end, I think it was a blessing.
Well, you're one of the people I've met here at the Antigua Forum. I'm fascinated with the project that you're working on now. Tell us about it.
What we're trying to do is to create a movement in Colombia, but that also transcends Colombia, to get drug legalization going, especially to end prohibition. We're not saying that drugs are good. We are focusing on the struggle to end drug violence. Because as long as you maintain prohibition, as long as the business is in the hands of gangsters and violent criminals, there's going to be deaths, there's going to be shootings, there's going to be all sorts of catastrophic consequences, unforeseen consequences of prohibition. And the only way to end that is by making the product legal and passing the business from the gangsters to legal, legitimate, and job-creating enterprises.
And presumably taxable enterprises.
And taxable enterprises, exactly. And with that tax revenue, you could fund educational programs, drug prevention programs, rehabilitation programs. As of now, or in the last few years, we've been spending approximately $7 billion of Colombian money on the drug war, on the military solution, which has, as I said, all sorts of unforeseen consequences. And I'll give you an example. Coca growers, since their crops are sprayed from the air by airplanes especially, they tend to move their crops to where they won't be spread. So they have been moving to national parks that are supposed to be protected because they're supposed to be the most vulnerable pieces of our territory.
So it's causing environmental degradation.
On top of the corruption, on top of the violence, it's also an environmental catastrophe.
Ending drug prohibition was once considered a crazy idea, but we're seeing it now for marijuana in the United States. Does that give you any hope that people might change their attitudes?
Absolutely. That is very encouraging, what we're seeing in Colorado and other states in the United States. I recently saw a poll according to which more than half of Americans would be willing to end the federal prohibition on marijuana. So I definitely think the general trend in the United States, also in Europe, is going away from prohibition. And since Colombia is at the root of the drug war and at the root of the problem, I think it's very important that Colombians also lead the global struggle to raise awareness, but also to take concrete actions to end the drug war.
Colombia is a very polarized society today, as you point out. As you put Verdad together, who do you imagine inviting to join?
Well, we've been very lucky in the sense that we're already creating an advisory board. Giancarlo Ibargüen, the former president of Universidad Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala, has already agreed to join. We are looking to bring people from different countries in Latin America, people involved in the legalization struggle in the US and Europe. We're trying to bring a broad coalition. It doesn't have to be only free marketeers or libertarians. We're trying to get people from across the political spectrum, because we don't have to agree on everything, but we can agree that we have to end drug violence and that we can end drug violence if we take the appropriate steps. So we're trying to create, as I said, the broadest coalition possible. We're also trying to get maybe religious leaders involved, people from the media, people from the financial sector that see a potential in the business of a legal cocaine or marijuana trade in Colombia.
Can you imagine getting members of FARC or the military involved?
Well, that would be a challenge, but we certainly will try. And if we can't get someone from FARC, there are definitely people from the Colombian democratic left who would support our effort to end drug violence. And they would be more than welcome.
So you're not going to align yourself with any one party?
No. We're going to try to avoid sectarianism and polarization, and we're going to try to build. We're not going to try to divide.
Danielle, this is a very big challenge. How many years of your life do you think it's going to take?
I think it's impossible to predict at this stage, because I think if you would have asked someone in the United States, even in Colorado, 10 years ago, if they would have thought that in 2015, Colorado would have had a completely liberal marijuana policy where even the sale of marijuana and the commercialization of marijuana was possible, they would have been quite skeptical. So I think if we leave things alone and if we allow things to unfold by themselves, then it would certainly take many decades, probably beyond my lifetime. But I am a firm believer in what people can achieve, especially when they work together, when they have a good strategy, when they have a message that moves people, not only in one country, but across the globe. And I think that's exactly what we can do, and what we have already begun doing in Colombia and during the past few days here at the Antigua Forum in Guatemala.
There are a lot of people on both sides of the drug war that have a vested interest in keeping it going, that are willing to put up with the violence for their own purposes. Do you worry for your own safety?
I don't worry for my safety at this point. if I do begin to worry for my safety, or if there are reasons for me to worry for my safety, it means that we're having an incredible amount of success. So that would be encouraging. When you talk about the vested interests, and something I've said during the past few days is one of the problems with the drug war is that the drug war itself has become colossal government program.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who tries to counter bureaucracy in any way will know how difficult it is to roll back a government program once it is in place, let alone when it has been operating for decades and growing almost without limit.
Do you think there might be a segment of society addicted to violence for its own sake, or do you think they're redeemable?
There certainly is the theory in Colombia that Colombians are simply violent and incapable of following the rule of law, but I'm not so sure, because if you see Colombians, for instance, the minute they arrive in the United States or maybe in a northern European country, they're the most law-abiding citizens you can imagine in most cases.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's a genetic problem. I don't think it's a geographical problem. I just think it's a matter of getting the right strategy, of getting the right rules in place in order to allow legal free market to develop, in order to develop a regulated free market, like in the case of alcohol and tobacco. Nobody's saying that alcohol is necessarily good or that cigarettes are necessarily good, but you would be in a much worse situation were they to be illegal.
So Daniel, founding Verdad is a big undertaking. What's your next step?
Our challenge this year, 2015, has a lot to do with the internal Colombian debate, because as I said, almost half the country supports the peace process with the FARC and the political solution. The other half of the country opposes the political solution, and they favor a military solution. But we are somewhere in the middle, because what both sides have in common is that they're both willing to allow the drug war to continue. And our point is, peace is fine, but the violence will continue even if you sign a peace treaty with the FARC, as long as you leave the fundamental structure of the drug trade intact, which is what is apparently going to happen. So what we have to do in Colombia, also in other countries, is to win the narrative, saying that we have the real answer for peace in Colombia, and peace in Colombia necessarily goes through the legalization process, through the end of prohibition. And this is the argument that we have to make, and we have to win an argument not only against one side, but against both sides. And both sides are dominating mainstream opinion in Colombia right now. So it's a formidable challenge, but I believe it can be done.
Well, if the history of alcohol is any consolation, history is on your side. Daniel, good luck, and please stay safe.
Thank you, Bill.
That was Daniel Raisbeck, Director Archivo Historico at the Universidad del Rosario in Bogotá and founder of Verdad, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. That wraps up our show for this week. We'd like to welcome our newest listeners in San Francisco on KNEW 960 AM and KOSF 103.7 FM HD2, along with our regular listeners in Boston, Detroit, Tucson, Pensacola, and Hayes and Larned, Kansas. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.